The fragile calm that had settled over parts of eastern Ukraine shattered with terrifying violence early this morning as a massive, meticulously prepared Russian offensive erupted across multiple axes, achieving significant territorial gains and triggering deep alarm and frantic diplomatic activity across Western capitals. Reports from the front line describe a relentless assault combining overwhelming artillery barrage, swarms of attack drones, concentrated armor thrust, and waves of infantry, overwhelming Ukrainian defensive positions that had been strained to their breaking points by months of attritional warfare and delays in critical Western military aid. The sheer scale and coordinate ferocity of the attack, catching Ukrainian forces somewhat off balance despite warning, suggests a major strategic shift by Moscow, one aimed at decisively altering the battlefield calculus before potential increase in Western support would fully materialize. Initial breakthrough were reported near the battered city of Avdiivka, along a symbol of Ukrainian resistance. Russian forces, utilizing lesson learned from the grinding battle for the city earlier in the conflict, employed intense thermobaric rocket strikes and precision glide bombs to obliterate fortified positions, followed by rapid mechanized infantry advance supported by T-90M tanks and BMPT Terminator fire support vehicles. Ukrainian brigades, critically low on artillery shells and air defense missiles, struggled to maintain cohesive defensive line under the weight of fire. Within hours, Russian units were reported to have pushed several kilometers west and northwest of Avdiivka, threatening to encircle Ukrainian units still holding ground in the area and forcing a chaotic, costly withdrawal under fire. Simultaneously, further north near the town of Kreminna in the Luhansk region, another powerful Russian grouping surged forward, exploiting dense forest cover and utilizing specialized assault units. They penetrated Ukrainian defenses along the Siversky Donets River, establishing several bridgeheads and pushing toward the key logistic hub of Liman. Ukrainian commanders acknowledged the loss of several villages in the sector, emphasizing the difficulty of holding ground against such concentrated force without adequate counter-battery fire or air cover to disrupt Russian assault formation. The southern front, particularly in the Zaporizhia region, also witnessed intense fighting. Russian forces launched significant probing attacks near the village of Robotin, an area Ukrainian forces had painstakingly liberated during their 2023 counteroffensive, only to see it become a bloody stalemate. Today, however, the probes escalate into a full-scale assault, utilizing layered minefield laid in recent months and pre-sighted artillery. Russian forces inflicted heavy casualties on Ukrainian units attempting to reinforce forward positions. Armored columns, spearheaded by T-80 BVM tanks and supported by Lancet and FPV kamikaze drones, pushed forward aggressively, seeking to recapture lost ground and potentially threaten the strategic city of Orikhiv, a vital Ukrainian strongpoint. The intensity of the fighting in the south underscored Russia's apparent aim to stretch Ukrainian reserves thin across a vast front line, preventing them from concentrating forces to blunt the main thrusts near Avdiivka and Kreminna. The human cost of the day's fighting was described by Ukrainian medical personnel as catastrophic. Field hospitals near the breakthrough points reported being overwhelmed with casualties, primarily suffering from severe shrapnel wounds, traumatic amputations, and blast injuries consistent with intense artillery and aerial bombardment. Communication intercepts and social media channels monitored by open-source intelligence groups suggest significant losses among Russian assault units as well, particularly in the initial waves attempting to breach minefield and fortified positions. However, the sheer volume of Russian troops and equipment committed appeared designed to absorb these losses. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in a hastily arranged address, confirmed the severity of the situation. The enemy has thrown everything they have into this attack, he stated, his voice strained. They are attacking along the entire front, seeking to exploit our momentary difficulties. The situation is extremely difficult. We need weapons, artillery, long-range system, air defense, delivered not in weeks or months, but now. Every hour counts. He praised the courage of Ukrainian defenders, but made no attempts to downplay the territorial setbacks or the critical nature of the moment. The offensive sent immediate shockwaves through NATO headquarters in Brussels and key Western governments. Emergency meetings were convened at the Pentagon, the British Ministry of Defense, the German Chancellery, and the Élysée Palace in Paris. Initial assessment pointed toward Russia committing a significant portion of its operational reserves, estimated to be upwards of 50,000 fresh troops, along with hundreds of tanks and armored vehicles that had been held back for months, possibly refurbished and reconditioned. Satellite imagery analyzed by Western intelligence agencies in recent weeks has shown large troops and equipment concentrations near the border area of Belgorod and Kursk, but the timing and precise objectives of the offensive remained uncertain until the first salvos landed. The speed and depth of the initial penetrations, particularly near Advitka, exceed many analysts' worst-case projections, raising immediate concerns about the stability of the entire Ukrainian defensive line in Donetsk Oblast. Secretary of Defense Peter Hegseth emerged from a classified briefing with the Joint Chief of Staff to deliver a stark assessment to reporters. What we are witnessing is a large-scale, multi-axis offensive by Russian force, Hegseth stated, his demeanor grave. Initial reports indicate they have achieved tactical success, exploiting vulnerabilities created by Ukrainian ammunition shortage, particularly in artillery and air defense. We are working around the clock, coordinating intensely with our allies to surge critical munitions to Ukraine. President Trump had been fully briefed and is actively engaged with our NATO partners and directly with President Zelensky. Hegseth emphasized the United States commitment but avoided specific promise on timelines, highlighting the logistical challenge of rapidly delivering large quantities of heavy weaponry. He confirmed that prepositioned stock in Poland were being activated, but stressed the need for European allies to accelerate their own contributions significantly. The reaction in European capitals was a mixture of alarm and urgent action. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, facing his first major international crisis since taking office, announced an immediate acceleration of planned military aid shipment, including more Storm Shadow cruise missiles and a significant batch of artillery shells. Putin has chosen the path of escalation and brutality, Starmer declared. The UK stands unwaveringly with Ukraine. We will not let aggression prevail. In Berlin, Chancellor Olaf Scholz convened his security cabinet, while Germany has been a major provider of military aid, including Leopard tanks and Patriot air defense systems. Domestic political constraint and a historically cautious approach have often led to delays. Facing the stark reality of the Russian advance, Scholz reportedly faced intense pressure from within his coalition, particularly from the Greens, to immediately authorize the transfer of long-range Taurus cruise missiles, a capability Ukraine has long requested but Germany has consistently refused, citing fears of escalation. French President Emmanuel Macron, who had recently escalated his rhetoric about the possibility of deploying Western troops in non-combat roles, spoke with Zelensky and several European leaders. The Élysée Palace issued a statement condemning the brutal and unprovoked escalation and promising unprecedented measures to support Ukraine. Though specifics were not immediately detailed, Macron reportedly pushed for an emergency meeting of EU defense ministers to coordinate a massive, immediate ammunition airlift. The offensive also triggered frantic diplomatic activity. Secretary of State Marco Rubio was reported to be in near constant communication with his counterparts across NATO, the EU, and key Indo-Pacific allies like Japan and South Korea, urging them to expedite existing aid pledge and consider new contributions. Rubio also placed urgent calls to the leadership of neutral but concerned nations like India and Brazil, emphasizing the global consequences of a Russian victory and urging them to reconsider their position. A central focus was securing immediate financial backing for Ukraine beyond military aid. As the economic strain of the war and the massive cost of reconstruction loom ever larger, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was actively engaged with international financial institutions and key allies to explore mechanisms for unlocking frozen Russian assets or securing large-scale loans backed by future reparations. Through these are complex legal and political undertaking unlikely to yield immediate cash. The urgent need was for billions to keep the Ukrainian government functioning, paying soldiers and civil servants, and maintaining basic services amid the intensified conflict. Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard briefed key congressional committees in closed session. While the content remained classified, sources familiar with the discussion indicated the intelligence community assessed that Russian President Vladimir Putin had likely authorized the offensive with several key objectives: to deliver a decisive battlefield victory before the U.S. election campaign intensifies further, to shatter Western morale and unity by demonstrating Ukraine's inability to hold territory without constant, massive infusion of aid, to force Ukraine into negotiations from a position of extreme weakness, and to seize as much of the resource-rich Donbas region as possible as a strategic and economic prize. Gabbard reportedly emphasized the role of renewed and expanded military support from Iran and North Korea in enabling Russia's ability to sustain such a large-scale offensive, particularly regarding artillery ammunitions and attack drones. The scale of ammunition consumption observed in just the first day of the offensive was described as staggering, underlining the critical nature of the West's own production bottleneck. The offensive immediately impacted global energy and financial markets. Oil price surged by over 5% on fears of prolonged disruption to Black Sea shipping routes and potential targeting of energy infrastructure. European natural gas prices also jumped, reigniting concerns about energy security despite high storage levels. As the conflict escalation threatened to destabilize the region further, stock market, particularly in Europe, fell sharply, with defense sector stocks being the notable exception, soaring on expectations of increased military spending. The Russian ruble weakened significantly as investors fled perceived risk, though the Kremlin's strict capital controls limit the immediate damage. Grain prices also rose on renewed fears for Ukrainian exports, critical for global food security, especially in the Middle East and Africa. The fragile global economic recovery, already facing headwinds, now confronted a major new source of instability and uncertainty. Within Russia, state media portrayed the offensive as a glorious, long-awaited breakthrough, a liberation gathering momentum. Footage purportedly showing Russian troops raising flags in recaptured village dominated news broadcasts, accompanied by triumphant music and hyperbolic commentary from Kremlin propagandists. President Putin was expected to address the nation soon, likely framing the operation as a necessary response to Ukrainian aggression and NATO encroachment. However, independent Russian media channels operating from abroad, as well as messaging app channels used by soldiers' families, painted a grimmer picture, reporting heavy casualties and questioning the strategic wisdom of throwing poorly trained mobilized troops and hastily refurbished equipment into frontal assault against prepared defenses. Even once weakened by shortage, the disconnect between the official narrative and the potential human cost remains stark. The immediate challenge for Ukraine is to stabilize the front line, prevent the initial breakthroughs from becoming operational uncircumvented, and buy time for critical Western munitions to arrive. Reports indicate Ukrainian commanders were rushing reserve brigades, including some held back for potential counteroffensive actions, into the breach near Advivka and Kreminna. These units, some equipped with Western-provided Bradley infantry fighting vehicles and Leopard tanks, are engaging in fierce counterattack to blunt the Russian spearheads and relieve pressure on units in danger of being cut off. The effectiveness of these counterpunch, often conducted under heavily artillery fire and drone surveillance, will be crucial in determining the depth of the Russian advance. Ukrainian Special Operations Forces are also reportedly conducting deep raids behind Russian lines to disrupt logistic and target command posts, aiming to slow the momentum of the assault. Every destroyed ammunition truck, every disrupted communication node buys precious hours for the main defense lines to regroup. For the West, the panic stems not just from the immediate territorial losses, but from the glaring exposure of systematic weaknesses. The month-long delay in passing the U.S. supplemental aid package, driven by domestic political wrangling, directly contributed to the ammunition shortage crippling Ukrainian defenders today. European promises to deliver 1 million artillery shells by March 2024 fell disastrously short, reaching only a fraction of that target. A failure of political will and industrial capacity that now has lethal consequences. The inability to provide sufficient air defense systems has left Ukrainian cities and frontline troops vulnerable to the very glide, bombs, and missiles enabling Russian advances. The debate over long-range weapons like ATACMS and Taurus, tempered by fears of escalation, now looks dangerously short-sighted as Russian forces mass within range of Ukrainian territory using weapons supplied by Iran and North Korea without similar restraint. The offensive is a brutal stress test of Western resolve, unity, and industrial might. The initial response, emergency meetings, accelerated shipments, promises of unprecedented support must translate into tangible, massive, and immediate deliveries of weapons and ammunition reaching the front lines within days, not weeks. Failure risks not just further Ukrainian territorial losses, but a fundamental shift in the strategic balance that could embolden Russia and other authoritarian powers globally. The panic in Western capitals is real. Whether it galvanizes decisive action or paralyzes into further debates remains the critical questions hanging over the conflict as night falls on a dramatically altered battlefield. The coming 48 hours are likely to be decisive. Ukrainian forces are fighting with extraordinary tenacity, but courage alone cannot stop artillery shells and tanks columns without the tools of war. The West holds those tools. Its willingness to deliver them at the speed and scale demanded by the crisis will determine the fate of Ukraine and shape the future of European and global security. The Russian offensive has ripped open the facade of stalemate. The response will define whether this is the beginning of a painful reversal or desperate, costly holding action before reinforcements arrive. The world watches and waits with bated breath. The logistical nightmare facing Ukraine cannot be overstated. Major supply routes running westward from the Donbas, already under constant threat from Russian artillery and drones, are now under increased pressure due to the territorial gains. Key highways near Advivka and Crimea are either cut or under direct fire controls, forcing Ukrainian logistic units to take longer, more dangerous detour across rough terrain, consuming precious fuel and time. Reports emerge of ammunition depot being hastily relocated further west under cover of darkness, a dangerous and complex operation vulnerable to Russian reconnaissance drone and satellite surveillance. The strain on Ukrainian truck drivers, mechanics, and fuel supplies is immense. They operate as unsung heroes, navigating minefields, destroyed bridges, and constant bombardment to deliver the lifeblood of the front line. Every kilometer, the Russian advance stretches these tenuous supply lines further, making the timeline delivery of the newly promised Western aid even more critical and challenging. The offensive has not only attacked Ukrainian soldiers, but also the intricate, fragile network that keeps them fighting. NATO's eastern flank reacted with heightened vigilance. Poland and the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia immediately placed their armed force on increased readiness. Polish Defense Minister Władysław Kosiniak-Kamysz announced the activation of additional surveillance assets along the border with Belarus, a key Russian ally and staging ground, and accelerated the movement of reserve units toward reinforcement points. This Russian offensive confirms our worst fear about Putin's imperial ambitions. ATACMS stated, Poland's borders are NATO's borders. We are prepared to defend every inch. Similar moves were observed in Romania and Bulgaria, with increased naval patrols in the Black Sea and enhanced air policing missions. The offensive served as a grim validation of years of warning from these frontline states about Russian revanchism, hardening their resolve and intensifying calls for an even greater permanent NATO presence and faster military modernization within the alliance. The sense of vulnerability, temporarily eased by Ukraine's earlier resistance, returned with a vengeance. The human tragedy unfolding behind the new front lines is profound. Civilians in villages and towns suddenly overrun by advancing Russian troops face terror and uncertainty. Reports difficult to verify immediately but consistent with past Russian conduct emerge of forced deportation, filtration camp, and summary execution of individuals deemed potential threats, including former Ukrainian soldiers, local officials, and volunteers. Communication blackouts were imposed in occupied areas, severing families. Those attempting to flee the fighting faces perilous journeys along roads under artillery fire, joining the millions of Ukrainians already displaced internally or as refugees abroad. Humanitarian organizations like the Red Cross and Médecins Sans Frontières reported immense difficulties accessing newly contested areas to evacuate wounded civilians or deliver essential supplies like food, water, and medicine. The offensive instantly created a new wave of suffering, adding thousands more to the grim toll of a war now entering a new, even more brutal phase. The world's attention focuses on the military maps, but the human cost in shattered lives and communities mounted hourly. Military analysts scrambled to interpret the tactical nuances and predict the next move. The initial Russian successes demonstrate a refined, if brutally costly, approach compared to the disastrous early months of the invasion. The integration of drones for reconnaissance, artillery corrections, and direct kamikaze attacks was more sophisticated, overwhelming Ukrainian electronic warfare countermeasures in key sectors. The use of concentrated armored twist formation, supported by intense and sustained artillery fire, recalls Soviet-era doctrine but adapted with modern surveillance and precision, albeit often masked. Firepower, however, vulnerabilities remain apparent. Ukrainian anti-tank teams, utilizing javelins, NLAWs, and domestically produced weapons, inflicted significant losses on Russian armor during the assault, particularly when Ukrainian artillery managed to disrupt the coordination between Russian tanks and infantry. The depth of the penetration also created long, exposed flank potentially vulnerable to Ukrainian counterattack if reserve and firepower could be concentrated. The critical question was whether Russia had the operational reserves and logistical capacity to exploit their breakthrough rapidly before Ukrainian defenses could solidify further back or Western aid arrive in decisive quantities. Was this the start of a sustained war-winning push or powerful but ultimately exhausting spams? The answer lay in the intensity of fighting over the next few days and the speed of the Western response. The political ramifications within Ukraine were immediate and intense. While President Zelensky projected unity and resolve in his address, the massive territorial losses and the scale of the military setback inevitably fueled criticism and questions. Voices within the Ukrainian parliament, Verkhovna Rada, and among military commentators questioned strategic decisions regarding the allocations of scarce resources in the preceding month. Were reserves positioned correctly? Was enough done to fortify secondary defense line? The pressure on the military high command, led by Commander-in-Chief Alexander Syrsky, intensified dramatically. Syrsky, known for his aggressive defensive tactics during the defense of Kyiv and the Kharkiv counteroffense, now faced the immense challenge of managing a large-scale retreat under fire while preserving combat power. Public confidence, while still strongly behind the fight for national survival, was visibly shaken by the image of retreating troops and lost villages. Maintaining national morale in the face of such setbacks became as crucial as stabilizing the front lines. The unity forged by invasion was being tested by fire once more. The role of Iran and North Korea in enabling the offensive came under intense scrutiny. US and European intelligence officials presented evidence, including satellite imagery and debris analysis, showing a significant recent influx of Iranian-designed Shahed 136-131 drones and Fateh-110 short-range ballistic missiles, alongside North Korean 122mm and 152mm artillery shells and KN-23 ballistic missiles. This offensive would not be possible at this scale and intensity without the reckless and destabilizing support provided by Tehran and Pyongyang. Secretary of State Marco Rubio asserted in a statement, "They are complicit in every war crime, every civilian death resulting from this escalation." Calls grew within the US Congress and among European allies for significantly harsher sanctions targeting Iran's drone and missile programs and North Korea's illicit arms network. There were also debates about potential kinetic responses, such as strikes on Iranian drone production facilities or vessel smuggling weapons in the Caspian Sea. Though the risk of wider regional escalation made such action highly contentious, the offensive underscores how Russia's invasion had become a nexus for authoritarian collaboration against the Western-led order. The potential for nuclear signaling or escalation, always a dark undercurrent in the conflict, resurfaced with renewed urgency. Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard reportedly briefed President Trump and the National Security Council on heightened activity at known Russian nuclear storage sites, though assessments suggested this was likely part of routine readiness exercise or deliberate signaling rather than imminent preparation for use. However, the context of a major conventional offensive achieving success inevitably raised the specter of how Russia might react if its advance were decisively halted by a surge of Western-enabled Ukrainian resistance. Would Putin, facing the prospect of another humiliating setback after initial gains, resort to nuclear threats or even limited tactical use to freeze the conflict on favorable terms? This terrifying calculus weighed heavily on Western policymakers, potentially influencing decisions about the type of weapons provided, like continued reluctance on long-range missiles that could strike deep inside Russia, and the rhetoric employed. Secretary of Defense Peter Hegseth was careful to state the U.S. commitment to Ukraine remained unwavering, but also emphasized communication channels with Moscow remain open to reduce risk of miscalculation. A clear reference to the nuclear dimension. The office had not only escalated the conventional war, but also dolloped the latent nuclear tension. The global South watched the escalation with deepening concern, but also a degree of wary resignation. Leaders in Africa, Asia, and Latin America reiterate calls for an immediate ceasefire and negotiations, lamenting the diversion of resources from pressing development needs and the impact on food and energy prices. However, the stark power disparity and the apparent determination of both Russia and the West left them feeling largely powerless to influence events. The non-aligned movement struggled to formulate a coherent response beyond general pleas for peace. Some nations, dependent on Russian weapons or grain, or skeptical of Western motives, remain reluctant to openly condemn Moscow's actions. The offensive reinforced a perception in parts of the global South that this was primarily a European NATO versus Russia conflict with devastating global spillovers, rather than a clear-cut case of defending the UN Charter. Maintaining their neutrality or engaging in pragmatic diplomacy with both sides became increasingly difficult as the conflict entered this dangerous new phase, further fragmenting the international response. The long-term strategic implications began to be debated even amidst the immediate crisis. If Russia consolidates significant new gains, it would control an even larger swathe of Ukraine's industrial heartland and coastline, strengthening its bargaining position immeasurably in any future negotiations. It would deal a potentially fatal blow to Ukraine's hope of liberating its entire territory through military means. For NATO, a successful Russian offensive would represent a profound failure of deterrence and collective defense, emboldening Putin and potentially inviting future aggression against other neighbors. It would necessitate a massive permanent increase in defense spending and force posture across Eastern Europe, fundamentally altering the continent's security architectures. Conversely, if Ukraine, bolstered by a rapid and massive infusion of Western aid, managed to halt the offensive and inflict unsustainable losses on the Russian attackers, it could break the back of Russia's remaining offensive capability and potentially create conditions for Ukrainian counterstrikes later in the year. The stakes of the battle unfolding across the smoky field and shattered towns of eastern Ukraine could not be higher, extending far beyond the immediate front line to the future of European security and the global balance of power. The panic triggered in the West by the Russian offensive was not merely about today's loss. It was a dawning realization of the immense cascading consequence of failure. Many of my listeners, like 70%, haven't subscribed to my YouTube channel. And so many of you don't even know that you haven't subscribed. And that is actually what makes the show going. It's almost like you're making a donation to the show. So that's why I ask again and again, because it enables us to grow and grow and grow. And we're going for the long haul here. And listen, if this is your first time listening to So Rich, you don't have to subscribe. You guys, your first one's on me. But if you have watched this show before, it's like you are a freeloader now. So all I would ask you is, if you have seen this show before and you like it, help me, help my team here. Hit that subscribe and like button now, and we will continue to build this show for you. That I swear, thank you to all of you guys who have subscribed. It means a lot to me. Thank you so much. That's all for me for today. I will see you soon. Bye for now.